Captured, stripped of your weapons, trapped beneath a crumbling city with only your wits and the dice to survive. This was the nightmare players faced when TSR unleashed the Slave Lords series of modules in 1980. I'm diving deep into D&D's most iconic adventures, starting with A1 through A4, the brutal, brilliant modules that changed tournament play forever. Let's uncover their history, the legends behind the creators, and why these adventures still haunt players to this day. Today on Daddy Rolled a 1. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin. This is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. It's also going to be the start of a new sort of sub-series that I'm doing of my history series, and this one's going to be on covering the TSR classic Dungeons & Dragons adventures from A to Z. And it's not A by title of the adventure, but A to Z by the alphanumeric codes that TSR used back in those days to designate different adventures. So if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, when TSR finally began publishing adventures, which started in 1978, so 4 years after the publication of Dungeons & Dragons in 1974, they decided to use a system of numbers and letters to designate what each adventure was kind of about, so that as a DM purchasing the adventure to run for your players, you would have an idea of what was happening with that adventure or the level that it might be covering. So the problem is the codes aren't really necessarily consistent. So the easiest ones to figure out, and someone just asked this in the comments, so this is just a quick overview, but if you start watching the series, you'll get the hang of it. But the easiest ones to figure out are the B series. B stands for basic. So those were for basic Dungeons and Dragons, but it actually covers at least 3 different editions of basics. So it starts with In Search of the Unknown, which was originally created for the Holmes Basic set in 1977. Then went to B2, Keep on the Borderlands, which actually does ship in the last year or so of the Holmes Basic set before the shift to Moldvay Basic. And then it was included in that. And then the later modules in the B series are actually designed for the BECMI edition and that basic set, the classic red box. But anyway, B stands for basic, X stands for expert. Those are the 2 super easy ones to figure out. And then those are also accompanied by the CM series for companion, M for masters, and IM for immortals. So those are specifically telling you which edition of the game you should be playing with those adventures. For the most part, the other numbered adventures or letter and numbered adventures were created for advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I said for the most part, it's not 100%, but it's close, right? So you have the debut of the first module, which is G1 in 1978, and G stands for giants. So one of the things that you'll see with these letters, sometimes the G stands for sort of a theme that those adventures were about. G for giants, D for drow or descent into the depths of the earth, or U for underwater, and things like that, right? So sometimes it is for a theme. Sometimes it's for a campaign setting. Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, Greyhawk all had adventures that were had an alphanumeric code. Sometimes it's for the level, a rough level guide. So as an example, the N series were for novice level adventures, meaning first level characters. So that's the N series. I was for intermediate. So in those cases, the modules don't connect together. A lot of times the modules do connect together, and that's what we're going to be talking about here today with the A series. So this is commonly referred to as the Slavers series or the Slave Lords series. So you may be wondering why they're coded with A instead of with, say, S. Well, the reason for that is that when these modules were published, the first one was A1 in 1980, and by that point, the S series of modules, starting with S1, Tomb of Horrors, had already started to be published. And the S in that stood for special. Those were special adventures. So they couldn't use S. Well, the A series was also based on tournament adventures that were run at Gen Con prior to their publication for the mass market. So they could have been called T, except that they couldn't because the T series of modules had also already been started to be published with T1, The Village of Hamlet. They also kind of thought, oh, maybe you could use C for competition because they were from tournament adventures, except that had already been used with C1, the Hidden Shrine of Tamawachan. So, or Tamawachan. I always pronounce it differently, so forgive me for that. But anyway, they were trying to come up with the code. And so author Lawrence Schick, who wrote this last one in the series, A4, he says that they decided to use A to name it for the Eyrie of the Slave Lords, which was like the slave lords' hideout. So the A stands for Eyrie, but he also said they picked it very specifically so that when you were listing the modules, these would be listed first. And so that was kind of like their little trick because they were a little annoyed that they couldn't use the numbering that they wanted. Okay, so that's where the A series comes from. And that's kind of just a quick overview of like why these modules had letter and numbered codes. As you get further on into second edition of Dungeons and Dragons, even during the TSR era, they're going to let go of these alphanumeric codes. But a lot of old school retro publishers like Goodman Games used to use them a lot when they were publishing adventures for their games, either for third edition or for first edition or whatever it was. They would use alphanumeric codes. Okay, so these modules, again, were based on this A series of modules were based on the tournament adventures that were run at Gen Con 13 in 1980. And so we're going to dive into those. But before we get to that, I'd like to ask if this history of talking about this and knowing where these adventures came from and why they're named the way they are and learning about the creators is something that interests you, please take a few seconds to like this video. Make sure that you're subscribed to my channel. Check your notifications with the bell icon so that you know when I upload new videos. And if you could do me a favor and share this with your friends and on social media or however you want to share it with them to make sure that people are aware that my channel exists, I would really, really appreciate it. Okay, so in Gen Con 13, these modules were, well, they weren't modules back then. They were just run as tournament adventures. And we'll kind of talk about the differences as we get into that. But it all started, actually dates back to Gen Con 12, the year prior in 1979. And during Gen Con 12, there were some adventures run or tournaments run. There was the Masters Tournament, and there was the AD&D Open and a few different ones, but all of them were managed and run by a third party. They were not run by TSR. And a lot of complaints started to pop up about these. People thought the AD&D Open was way too high level. There was a fight with Orcus at the end of that people thought was not really super realistic for a tournament. There were 324 players, which is a lot, but the third party, whoever's managed that, people thought maybe they didn't really quite have a handle on how to run a tournament of that level. And so the folks at TSR decided that they were going to take matters into their own hands and they were going to create the tournament adventures for Gen Con 13. And one of the things that they'd realized was that because it happens in rounds, that sometimes people who went later had a leg up because they heard what had already happened with other groups that went before them, like over the course of the convention. And they wanted to avoid that happening. They didn't want people having any knowledge that other players didn't have because these were being scored as a tournament. And so they didn't want players who played later, groups who started later, to have an undue advantage because, obviously that's not fair. And they also were touting that it was going to be the biggest tournament ever. They were expecting about 800 players and they needed to figure out a way to whittle this down while keeping everything fair. And so they decided to hold it as a 3-round tournament. So the introduction, the semifinals, and then the finals. But the introduction, that first round, was going to be played over 3 different days, Thursday through Saturday. And they decided that in order to keep people from hearing about, like, people who played on Saturday for the first time, in order to keep them from having heard what happened from people who played on Thursday and Friday, they were going to have 5 different introductory adventures for this tournament. And that they had to balance all 5 of those equally, but they were all going to be different. So they decided to have 5 different first rounds, followed by a semifinal and then a final. And what this led to was that they knew they were going to have different players playing on different days, going through different dungeons in order to reach the semifinals. And one of the things that necessitated that, because now you're having to write essentially 7 different tournament adventures, the 5 introductions, the 1 semifinal, and the 1 final, they decided that was too much work for one person, which of course it is. So they divided it up across 4 authors. So different players, different days, different dungeons, and different authors. And that's going to actually kind of lead to our first selection of problems. So the only link between all of these adventures was this theme of the slave lords. And author Lawrence Schick, again, who writes, he's going to write the fourth adventure here. He mentions that the reason that they did that was because by the time you get to 1980, so remember, it's only 2 years after the publication of the first adventure that TSR published, the first standalone adventure, I should qualify, that they published, which is G1, Studying the Hill Giant Chief. Well, in the intervening 2 years, they'd kind of realized that they'd sort of used up this idea of just like, connecting a bunch of random rectangles in a dungeon and having players go in and fight the monsters and take their treasure, that there needed to be more to it, more meat. And really what they were looking for was a reason for the players to go into the dungeon and fight the creatures and take their stuff. And so they collectively came up with this idea of exploring the slave lords concept from the world of Greyhawk. And they thought like, well, that's great because like what's worse than slavery? And so if all of the monsters that you're fighting are somehow working for the slavers, then you have no compunction about killing them because they're evil, because they're slavers. And he's like, so voila, that was solved. That part was solved. So the slave lords is the through line that connects all of these, but that's really the only thing that kind of connects them, kind of in a way. And having these different authors work on this does lead to inconsistencies in terms of the writing style, as well as even just the presentation of these different adventures. And you're going to see that as we go through that. So all of these adventures are sort of designed to follow a linear path, that you're going to start with A1 and you're going to work your way through all the way to A4. And as a matter of fact, they started with the idea of what was going to happen at the beginning of A4. And then everything that was before that was written for the tournament and for these published adventures was written with the idea that this is where you're leading to, as to how the introduction to A4 happens. Okay, and again, we'll get to that as we go through these. So that was the path that they were leading towards. And I will point out there are going to be some minor spoilers in here as you go through this. So if this is something that you're interested in playing, and you've not played through it before, I mean, these are, over 40 years old at this point, then I guess, ask your dungeon master to check out this video so you can learn more about these adventures. Okay, so now these were planned to be released at Gen Con 13, like at the convention shortly after the tournament had ended. However, there were production delays and things happened. And so the first adventure, which is A1, was not released until October of 1980. So in the fall, after Gen Con had happened that summer. And then, in fact, these three adventures right here, A2, A3, and A4, were not published until a year later in 1981. Not quite a year later. It was like, 6 or 7 months later. But still, they came out much later than they had originally planned to publish them. Okay, so now you see here that I only have in physical copy A2, A3, and A4. And that's because I got these in the mid 80s. So in I think it was for the 10th year anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons in TSR, 1984, TSR published these like sort of adventure packs or module packs where you could get 3 modules packaged together. And the way that they packaged them, you often didn't know, is if memory serves, I could be wrong on this, but if memory serves, I think because of the way they were packaged, you couldn't tell which one was in the middle. Like you could see the ones on either side of the edges, but whatever module was tucked in the middle, you couldn't quite tell what it was going to be. And they didn't always go together. So I don't believe that these 3 came together. I think that they were spread across at least 1 or 2 other packs of modules. And my mom gave these to me, and I never got A1. I only got these 3 through those packs. And I think the reason was because they didn't package A1, because I think their thought was, from a marketing standpoint, if they gave you 2, 3, and 4, that you as a consumer would feel compelled to buy A1 separately to complete your set. And I just never did. So I do have it as a PDF, and that's what we are going to look at here in just a moment. Okay, so here we are with Module A1, Slave Pits of the Undercity by David Cook. And you see it's an adventure here for character levels 4 through 7. Now, we've talked about David Cook many, many times here on the channel before. He's known for a variety of different writings for TSR over the years. And he worked on, it's hard to say what is his biggest legacy because there's a few that kind of stick out. So he is the co-author of the expert set for the Moldvay Cookmarsh edition of Basic Dungeons and Dragons from 1981. So he worked on that. He also worked on co-authoring the famous module X1 Isle of Dread, wrote that with Tom Moldvay. So, and as I mentioned in my last video, he actually runs that. I know he's run it before at GaryCon for folks, and I don't know if that's something that he does every year, but I think it's cool that you could play in the module written by the original person back in the day. He also famously wrote the Oriental Adventures book for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, 1985. So as we've talked before in my video on that, even though on the cover it says it was written by Gary Gygax, it's well accepted that Gary's name was put on there for marketing purposes, and that Dave Cook did the vast lion's share of the writing on that book. And then I said, it's hard to say what he's most famous for, but I think you could say that he's most famous, or some folks would say infamous, for the creation of the second edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 1989. So that's a quick look at Dave Cook, but again, we've talked about him many times here. And then this artwork that you see here on the front cover is by Jeff Dee, whom we've also talked about before, but has that kind of very comic book superhero style. And I usually say the easiest way to point out or to pick out a Jeff Dee piece of art is if you see somebody wearing pants with like flared legs at the bottom, like bell-bottom style pants. So now none of these characters necessarily have that, but once you see that, it's hard to not see it. Okay, so and you see it's dated here, 1980, the Jeff Dee painting that is. And we see three characters here fighting some kind of insect guy, and we're going to get into what that is and later as we get into the adventure. So I'll just read the little cover blurb here. It says, "It is time to put a stop to the marauders. For years, the coastal towns have been burned and looted by the forces of evil. You and your fellow adventurers have been recruited to root out and destroy the source of these raids. But beware, hundreds of good men and women have been taken by the slavers and have never been seen or heard from again. This module was originally used for the official Dungeons & Dragons tournament at Gen Con 13 and is the first of 4 in a series of related tournament modules from TSR. This module contains a challenging scenario, the tournament scoring system, plus 9 pre-rolled play-tested tournament characters. Also included are large-scale referees' maps, notes, and background information. A1 is a complete adventure in itself, but it is also a companion to A2, Secret of the Slaver Starcade, A3, Assault on the Area of the Slave Lords, and A4, in the Dungeons of the Slave Lords. So be sure to look for other exciting adventure modules from the Game Wizards at TSR. And then you can see here we've moved to, in 1980, a later era TSR logo. This is the kind of man in the moon logo that's a lot of players from the 80s. This is the logo they first think of when they think of TSR, as opposed to like the Lizard Man or the Wizard, or even like the very, very first one, which was the G and the K that we talked about for Gary Gygax and Don K. Okay, so let's just jump in here. Now we see this artwork on the inside front cover, also by Jeff Dee. And this is just, a party of adventurers fighting some guy. And again, we'll get into like what that is. It repeats that opening text. But what we're seeing here now is an evolution in the trade dress and the design of adventures for TSR, for Dungeons and Dragons. So you saw that Giants module that I showed earlier. That's known as like the kind of that look and feel is known as the monochrome style of adventures. And that was what they published the first few adventures that came out. So G1, 2, and 3 had that treatment, as did D1, 2, and 3. And T1 had that. S1, Tomb of Horrors. Also, I believe S2, White Plume Mountain, the original first printing of that was monochrome. C1, the Hidden Shrine of Tomoe-chan, which I've shown here on the channel before. And then B1, In Search of the Unknown. All of those had that monochrome trade dress. I think I got all of them. I might have missed one. Did I say T1, Village of Hamlet? That definitely had one. But then after that, they're going to start to move into this trade dress that you see here, the green color cover, and the font, where everything is just going to start to be consistent over time. This sort of sans serif font, We're using more use of bold and things like that, bold text to call things out. And that's partly just because the page layout stuff was getting a little bit easier. They're no longer doing these on like manual typewriters like the original publication of the Three Little Brown Books in 1974, but they're starting to use more professional kind of page layout. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the module as far as like necessarily piece by piece as like what's in here and how to run it. I'm going to give you the flavor of what these adventures are about. And again, talking more about the history and the creators. And then I will offer some tips along the way of things to look out for if you are going to run it, or things you might want to do ahead of time as you're getting ready. I am going to go, however, all the way to the back just to finish talking about the creators, since we started with Dave Cook and Jeff D. So you see here that the layout and editor is Brian Pitzer. So Brian was an early employee and hire at TSR, and he worked in what was known as the development department. So now at this point, TSR has been around for 6 years. Lawrence Schick has come in and started to kind of reorganize how the departments are going to relate and work together. And he's hired a bunch of people, and I believe he was the one who also hired Brian Pitzer. But the idea at the time was that they were going to have sort of 3 departments that worked together, but it was going to be the designer who came up with the original design for these things, and then it was going to be passed to the developer. And then that was the developer, and that was also a little bit of editing in that section. But those were people who kind of like would play test it, would figure out if it actually worked, take that original idea from the designer, and then get it close to something that could be published. And then they in turn are going to pass it along to production, who are going to finish editing. They're going to do the layout. And a lot of times they're also going to make changes. So the problem with these 3 divisions is that the lines were blurred as to who did what. And also a lot of times when they ran into trouble, people would pitch in from other departments and do things that weren't necessarily part of their job description. So while the idea of having these 3 kind of different areas and sections, and you'd move from one to the other was a good idea, again, based on how many people that the TSR was constantly hiring and then letting go as business went up and down and they had to contract their services. A lot of times people would fill in and do things, but Brian Pitzer normally fell into kind of like that development area, like that second stage. And then also, as you see here, editing and then doing layout. So he also famously worked on B3, module B3, which we'll talk about when we get there. It's the Palace of the Silver Princess. Okay, and then you see some other people here in editing. So Kevin Hendricks also worked with Brian Pitzer before, and there's a really great interview with Kevin Hendricks on the Grognardia blog that covers sort of Kevin's thoughts about working at TSR at the time. But Kevin worked in development as well as an editor, wrote for Dragon Magazine, and did quite a bit more in the RPG field. We have talked about Harold Johnson before, and I'm going to get to him in a minute because we're going to deal with him as being the primary author for the next adventure, A2. Okay, so Frank Mensner is a name most of you, I believe, would have heard, but he is the person who's going to edit and design the revision to the Moldvay Basics set that's going to become known as the Beckme edition of Basic D&D, Basic Expert Companion Masters and Worlds. That's Frank Mensner's like sort of quote-unquote masterpiece of D&D, is that version of D&D, and a ton of people started with that one. And then Paul Reich III, I think it's Reich III, we have talked about again before, but specifically you might remember, I think it was in my Dark Sun video when I went over the Dark Sun campaign setting. Paul Reich III is the guy who invented the Thrykean, the insect people, way before Dark Sun was even on the radar. So he invented them just to invent them. And then Evan Robinson, another editor here, works on A2, works on A3, worked on Top Secret, worked on B2. So these are people that just have a long history of working with TSR sort of during this, I guess you'd call it the golden era of TSR, this like kind of sort of like late 70s to early 80s time period. Okay, so and then we see the development on here as well. We see the art, Jeff D, David S. LaForce, Jim Rosloff, and Bill Willingham. We've talked about all of them here on the channel before. And then you see able assistants and you see playtesting. So it's fun to see some names of playtesters like Brian Bloom. Errol Otis, an artist, is also playtesting Jim Ward, we've talked about many times. I did a tribute to him after he passed away. Tom Moldvay, again, creator of the Moldvay edition of D&D. So it's pretty cool to see all those names. So those are those folks. So I'll go back to the beginning here. And so basically, the way that these modules are put together is it gives you the ability, if you want, to run it as a tournament adventure the way that it was played at Gen Con 13. So they give you that detail and they tell you specifically what parts to ignore. Now, when you're looking in a reproduction like this PDF, a lot of times in the maps, they say that like the shaded part of the maps, you should ignore that if you're just going to play the tournament. The problem is in a reproduction or a PDF, sometimes it's very, very difficult to see that shading. And you'll see that as we get to the maps. But it tells you like the module background. It tells you how to tournament start. So you see over here on the right-hand column, tournament start play commences with the character standing before a secret entrance at the back of a temple. So that's a key for anything like a tournament. Don't make the players waste time figuring out how to start the adventure. Just have them start the adventure. Tell them this is what you're doing. In a campaign play, you don't necessarily want to do that. You want to give the players hints and rumors and clues and have them feel that like they've decided to take up this quest. But in a tournament, when time's when you're on the clock, you've got to just start out and just tell them what it is that they're doing and have them go from there. So you see here, it says notes for the Dungeon Master that it's been designed for 6 to 8 characters of moderate levels, 4 to 7. That's pretty consistent throughout this series of A1 through 4. And sometimes I think they kind of undershot a little bit what level you would need to be. It's definitely, I think the higher in this one is going to be much better for you. And then you start to see it says that you should have several fighters, 1 or more clerics and magic users, and at least 1 thief. You should have magic weapons, and you should possess some other minor magic items such as potions or scrolls. And so it just kind of goes through that sort of background. It talks about the tournament notes that are going to be in here. And then it says there's random encounter tables, but then it's going to tell you that if you're running it as a tournament, you're not going to use the random encounters. So you don't need those. Now, one of the other things that is going to happen with this is that, so if you remember, I mentioned that the original tournament, there were 5 introductions, or first rounds, as they called it, 5 first rounds. So this module A1 is going to be 2 of those first rounds. And then module A2 is going to be 2 more of those first rounds. And then module A3 is going to be the last of those 5 first rounds and the semifinal. And then A4 is going to be the finale. So that's kind of how these are structured. And it's going to tell us that as we get into it. Okay, so you see here over here on the left-hand page, tournament notes, originally run at Gen Con 13. So that's where you get all the background on that. And then it talks about the small maps that are used. Certain conventions were followed in tournament play to ensure that many situations were handled the same way. So it says all the players are presented with pre-created characters. So, pre-gen characters. That's what people played. They couldn't bring their own characters. All characteristics have been listed, and it tells you that you can't change them if you want to play it as a tournament. You can't add equipment or delete or anything like that, or the spells that they have. You have to use them as is, because that's how they judged everybody, based on them having the same starting point. It tells you there's no wandering monsters in tournament play. It says monsters will fight. This is number 3. Monsters will fight to the best of their ability and will show no mercy or quarter. Attempts to bargain with them will result in failure. Monsters encountered in tournament play need never check morale and will not retreat or flee unless it is noted in the text. Monsters will be fully aware of the capabilities of their weapons, magic items, and spells, and will use these to their advantage. And then it says, number 4, note that between these modules, the tournament characters do not advance in level. Although tournament characters may accumulate experience points for their adventure, they will not be able to advance in level until the requisite amount of time is spent in training. The pacing of the modules is such that the characters are not allowed sufficient time to do this between adventures. That was a part of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. When you gained experience points enough to qualify for the next level, you didn't just automatically level up like you did in say, like original D&D or basic. In Advanced D&D, you have to train, and the training takes time, and only after you take that training can you then advance in level. And then it says number 5, a scoring system has been provided at the end of the module to help standardize the scoring for the tournament sessions. The scoring sheet's not identical to the one used at Gen Con Open, but it may be used as a method of determining top players from session to session. Okay, so now I want to go back here to the background on page 2, because this is one of the things that I think can help you set up this adventure. So it talks, for several years, organized bands of pirates and slayers have been making a living by raiding the coastal towns on the Sea of Girnat. Okay, so, or Girnat, however you want to say that. So it goes on through this, but basically what it's going to say at a certain point is it's going to say that these lords and the barons have finally determined to work together to put a stop to these slavers and these raiders. And so they've been hiring groups of adventurers. It says here, several bands of adventurers have been gathered together and will be sent to infiltrate the base and destroy the leaders of this evil band. So the idea here is that your group of player characters are one of several different groups of adventurers who have been hired to go take care of the situation, to handle the situation. And so because of that, I think it's a good idea, or it can be a good idea, it can be a fun idea to kind of set out ahead of time this idea in your campaign world that there are groups of adventurers that hire themselves out, and maybe even have something like an adventurers guild, like a guild of people that trains and offers support, where you can buy supplies, all this kinds of stuff for bands of adventurers. But it might also be a place where people go, prospective people looking to hire an adventuring band might go and interview prospective adventurers to see if that's the right group for, the mission that they have for them. So I think this is a cool idea. There was a very fun comic book that I read. It's not that old. It's called Rat Queens, and it's very clear. I've talked about this on the channel before, but it's very clear that the author has played D&D. And in fact, at one point they translated the characters into, I think at the time it was Pathfinder, but the idea in that is that the Rat Queens are an adventuring group, and they're all women, but it's like a female dwarf, and there's what they call a smidgen, which is their version of halfling, and there's like I think an elf or a half elf, and there's a human, and they have all the different classes, clerics and fighters and thieves and all that kind of stuff. But there are other adventuring groups that they compete with to like get jobs. And so it's a comedy. It's like a fantasy comedy, but I love that idea of having these competing groups of adventures. And in A1 here, very specifically, one of the things that you can do as the dungeon master is have your player characters run into some of these other groups, and maybe they're going to compete over what it is that they're doing and not actually work together. They might be rivals trying to be the ones that come back and save the day, however you want to set it up. Right. So I do think that's something that you might want to set up kind of ahead of time, so that this doesn't come out of nowhere. This idea that people can hire adventurers in different groups, and like the adventurers might all be heading to do the same mission, with the thought being a lot of them are just going to fail, right? Whether they die or not, they just might not be able to succeed. So I definitely think that's a fun thing that you can set up in this ahead of time. So the other things that are in here is that rather than starting, as it says, the tournament starting and you're going to go in, you need to kind of plant the seeds of like why the players are going to be doing this. And so there's a thing in here where you can use like an escaped slave who comes to deliver information and rumors and things like that. So, and again, if you want to build your player characters up and level before they take this on, these are things that you can start planting when they're first, second level. They can hear rumors of this slavers things that's happening in another part of the world, and they eventually might decide that they want to travel over there. So a few of the other things that are going on in this adventure and in the series as a whole is that because in the first rounds of adventures, the 4 different authors had to figure out how to write first round adventures that were different. However, they would all be equally balanced and fair, so that when they were scoring the players, if someone started in first round A and not in first round B, that the people who competed in each of those had the same chance of success and the ability to earn the same number of points with minimizing the same number of losses, right? So what they did was decide that they were going to create a formula. It's a very rigid and strict formula. And once you know that it's there, it's very easy to see it as you go through these. But each of the first 5 rounds, so again, all of A1, it has 2 parts. All of A2 has 2 parts. And then the first part of A3, all of those 5 parts have a formula that consists of 9 encounters. It's 2 traps, I should say, a trick, a problem, a base monster encounter. So each one of these different first rounds has a different base monster as they go through. They also have a base monster ambush, and then they have a base monster working with a higher level ally. And then there's one unintelligent monster, and then there's one brand new monster. So there's a lot of brand new monsters introduced in these adventures, and it's very specifically because that was one of the design parameters that they put behind this, is that they wanted each group of players that were competing in this tournament to have to face a monster that they didn't know anything about, if assuming that those players had read and memorized the monster manual. So that way they were all competing on the same ground level because they had no idea what this monster did or what it was capable of doing. And so another thing that's going to happen through these adventures is that the base monsters are going to get easier as you progress through to the semifinals and then to the final round. So the final round, the base monsters are the easiest of all of them, and you'll see that when we get there. But there was a reason for that, but it also was done to kind of subvert player expectations. So it starts out harder at the first round and it gets easier, quote unquote, as you go along. However, there's things that make up for that. Okay, so we have the pre-generated characters, as we talked about. And there's also, this takes place in the setting of the Pomarge. I'll show you the map in just a second when I get back to my credenza, in the world of Greyhawk. And so this is really very firmly locked into the world of Greyhawk, which did have these slave lords as part of it. So you see here, so this is the first part, the key to the temple level, the secret door and the spike trap. This is the first part of one part of the first round. Okay, and it goes through, and then you get to the sewer level, and this was another part. So while both of these are in this adventure here, and as players you can go through both, in the tournament situation you would have done one or the other and then been scored and whether you should move on to the next round. Okay, so now in the first part, the temple level, the monster that you're going to encounter, the new one, well, there's a basilisk, but that's not the new one. The new one is called a sundew. And that is going to be detailed at the end of the adventure. And then in the sewer level, the new monster is called the aspis. It's these creatures you see here down on the bottom right-hand page. Now, this is a problem a little bit with these adventures, is that the interior art is very, very minimal. It's very small, and it doesn't always detail and draw the things that you want them to. So, and again, we're going to see that as we go through these. So, but this is characters fighting the aspis. Okay. And so then you just go through, again, I'm not going to go through detail by detail what's in this adventure. Another thing that happens in here is that in this one, very specifically, they don't always name the key NPCs. So as a DM, you have to add that kind of detail. As we get later on in the series, they will name them, but in this one, they're kind of just not named, which is it's an interesting choice. We'll just put it that way. Okay, now, as you also see, it's very, very short. We're on page 18 and we're already done. So the credits here page is page 18. And then you're going to get the details of the new monsters, the aspis, and then the giant sundew. Okay, and then you're going to see our tournament characters here. So these are the ones that were used during the tournament. So there's Elwita, the female dwarf fighter. Now, what's fun about that is if we go back to our cover here, that's Elwita over here on the right with the red hair. And you'll also notice she has a beard. So this was conclusive proof as far as TSR level D&D is concerned that female dwarves have beards. Okay, so you have her. You have Ogre, a human fighter. Frida, a female human ranger. You have Caraway, a male human cleric. Blodgett, a male halfling thief, 5th level thief. You have Dread Delgath, a human male magic user. You have Fanstern, a human male illusionist. Eljaeus, a male half-elf cleric fighter, and Caintelva, a male elf fighter magic user. Now, one quick thing here on the name of Eljaeus. It's been suggested, and I think it's borne out because of some other names that we're going to see in here, that Eljaeus is really the initials LJS, which stands for Lawrence J. Schick, who worked on these adventures. So not this one specifically, but That's where that name comes from. Okay, so and then you see they give you all the weapons and magic items and then their spells. And then you see the tournament scoring. For this tournament, the highest scores will be awarded for completing the most room encounters before time runs out. Scoring also takes into consideration the number of characters surviving. And so then you see here how many points you get, the rooms encountered, and then the numbers of characters surviving. So if you go through one room only, but all 9 characters survive, you get 45 points. But if you go through all 9 rooms and all 9 characters survive, then you go through 400, you get 405 points. Okay, so and that rooms encounter, remember I told you there's 9 encounters. And they're very specifically designed. And then your scoring adjustments are if you cast Invisibility on the Halfling, you get plus 7 points. In room 1, you get plus 4 for attempting to find the trap. In room 3, you get minus 4 for sending one character in alone, etc., etc. I think it's really interesting just to kind of see like all these different scoring things, because these are the things that the designers thought that players might do, and then how they would score those points. So that's the scoring. Here are the maps. As you can see here, I told you it's very difficult to see what part of these maps were supposed to be shaded so that you didn't use them if you weren't playing in the tournament play. But all of these adventures, for the most part, A1 through 4, they give you the tournament stuff, and then they give you additional details if you wanted to run them as a part of a campaign. So it expands it. However, the expansion in here is very, very minimal. As you see, again, it only goes to page 18. And then here's our back cover, another piece of artwork by Jeff D. With this guy coming through. I think that's a hobgoblin. Not sure, based on the way that he drew it. And then it just lists the other adventures that are available there. So that's our quick look at, well, quick-ish for my channel, at A1, the Slave Pits of the Undercity. Now, there's going to be an article by Dave Cook, who is in Dragon Magazine number 43. It's going to talk about secrets for how you should be able to maneuver through this adventure. And so I'm going to go over that next. Okay, so this is the article I was mentioning. This is from Dragon issue number 43. This is Survival Tips for the Slave Pits by Dave Cook. So this is interesting. We don't see this too often in Dragon, where people will talk about how to play through one of the adventures that they've published. But this was, a special situation because it's, what was a tournament adventure. So, and also this acts as, advertising, for lack of a better word, of the adventures. So Dave here is going to say that Gen Con 13, if notable for nothing else, had the largest single AD&D tournament yet staged. So it ran over 4 days, became an endurance test for players and judges alike. And as 9 character teams battled their way past orcs, goblins, gnolls, and other perils to discover the secrets of the powers of the slavers and the pommage in the world of Greyhawk. And again, we're going to get to the details on where that's located in a second here. The first 5 rounds were required to narrow the contestants down to a mere 135 semifinals, which in turn became only 45 finalists. To do all this required 5 different first round scenarios. We talked about all that. So then he says these are all going to be published, and he tells you how they're going to be published. Now, what's interesting is at the time of this article, they thought that module number A3 was going to just be called Eyrie of the Slave Lords, but it's eventually going to be called Assault on the Eyrie of the Slave Lords. And then it says, briefly sketch the modules deal with the slave lords and their ring, an organized band of raiders. A1 starts the characters in a port city in the wild of Pommage, a region overrun by humanoids. They're to destroy the denizens of a ruined temple, so et cetera, et cetera. We talked about all of this. And then he says the following sections will give both the players and judges of the first module in this series, some advice and suggestions. And so then he says it became quite obvious what made a winning team, and that several of the qualities have been printed before. But in case you haven't learned those lessons, he says the most important factors for the teams that did well were organization and decisiveness. And then he says, organization showed in many ways since players were working with a 4-hour time limit and their time began the minute they were given the character sheets. Long setup times hurt the party, cutting into the amount of time that they had to actually play. Therefore, quickly deciding who should play what character and listing either on paper or a blackboard the hit points, class, level, and special items of each character helped to quickly get things underway. The choice of caller was also important. We've talked about this before, the idea of one player not shouting out, but one player telling the DM what the actions of all the other players. So not every player's not telling the DM what they're doing. They're telling the caller, and the caller is then telling the DM. So that's an interesting way of how people used to play. A strong, quick-thinking caller whom the others obeyed often pulled a mediocre team into the upper ranks. Quick decisions about what to do and bold actions usually succeeded in pulling a group through a tough situation. No party was helped by the magic user who said, I think I'll cast this spell. No, maybe I won't. Well, I don't know. And he said that type of play only slows down the game, frustrates the other players, and allows the DM more time for his planner to plan his or her actions. So I just ran a campaign for my daughter and her friends. They're going through module U1, Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh, although I've changed quite a bit of it at this point based on things that they've done. But the last we played just 2 days ago on Saturday. Today's Monday, November 28th. Or I'm sorry, November. It's Monday, April 28th, 2025. And we played this past Saturday. And there were so many times where I asked them, what are you going to do? What's happening here? And they would hem and haw, and they would get into these like round circular discussions that didn't solve anything. And I could tell the dad player was sometimes getting he gets a little frustrated, but he also doesn't want to be the one to make the decision. He wants them to be able to figure out how to make decisions because that's part of growing up. And so he usually stays out of it. Even if they ask for his opinion, he'll kind of say like, he'll turn it back on them. And that decisiveness, it's so funny. He mentioned right at the end of that session, he's like, they are just not decisive. And he did point out that if we did play with more frequency, that they would get better at it, because we do sometimes have a little bit too long of hiatus periods between sessions just because of everyone's schedules. But anyway, in the case where you're being timed, you have a 4-hour time limit at a convention, that stuff can kill your momentum and ruin your chances of success. And he says you shouldn't be afraid to fight. And he says, in some ways, this module is a hack and slash piece. Well, you're going to see as we go through these, they're all like that. They're all very much like that because that is designed for tournament play. He says, although there are some surprises, the sewers of the temple are well guarded and players will have to take on several defenses that are designed to kill intruders. And then he says 9 somewhat wounded characters will prove to be more useful than 4 or 5 fit characters. So he's trying to say minimize your losses. And then it's important to always advance. Players who ignore an obvious route because it looks too dangerous or impossible, or characters who waste time searching dead ends when there's someplace else to go, are not going to win. So these are all really more ideas that are specific for tournament play, not for campaign play. So, but I don't know if you're ever planning a tournament, but these are little tips that you want to be aware of, and they're not necessarily specific just to this module. Players should always keep an eye on the clock, watching the amount of time that they have left. Spells and special items for characters have been chosen specifically for the characters given in the back of the module. Certain encounters in the sewers and the temple have been designed to make best use of these spells and items. Character who has the wand of fire should realize that it was intended that he or she should use that item in the module. Therefore, spells and items should not be hoarded and never used. So not resource management like we've talked before with magic, but definitely use the things that you've been given, but should be saved until that moment when they can do the most damage to the enemy. It's a tricky guessing situation, and he goes on and on. And then when judging slave pits of the Undercity, it's important that the monsters act to the best of their ability. For example, orcs and half-orcs are intelligent and will know a great deal about fighting and how to survive. Aside from the instructions concerning how to handle monsters that are given in the module, certain other tactics may be normally followed by intelligent monsters, and he goes on from there. Now it's going to continue on page 59. And he says sometimes, the monsters might want to capture the party, several areas. There's false slaves. There's a final area of the tournament section would have more than enough figures to attempt to overpower a weakened or small party of characters. So he talks about that. Proper precautions would be taken to prevent thieves from escaping, or clerics from praying, or magic users from regaining their spells. So all things that would happen if you get captured. And then he says, however, if the DM doesn't want to go in all that trouble, it could be just as likely that the slavers would cut the throats of the party as a warning to other foolhardy adventurers of the risk they take. And then he says there's 2 corrections to be made on the map of A1, both of which should be obvious to those DMs who have already read the module. The first is in the upper section temple at area 16. It should be lettered 16A, 16B, and 16C, not 16, 16A, and 16B. Okay, fine. People make mistakes. And he just goes on. He says the others in the key of the module, the circle indicates a trap door in the floor, not a trap door in the front. And then he says A1 is fun and tough, a good challenge for a band of hardy adventurers of mid-level. As one player in the tournament said, I'm going to get this module and inflict it on my friends. If he did, they were sure to have some challenges. So that's the wrap up of our look at that article. And now we're going to go through the other 3 adventures and see how they all tie together. And again, some of the common themes that we're going to see in this series of adventures. Okay, so let's go on and look at the next module in the series. This is going to be A2, Secret of the Slaver's Stockade. Now, this was originally supposed to be called Stronghold of the Slave Lords, but they then changed the name to The Secret of the Slaver's Stockade. And as you can see here, it's written by Harold Johnson with Tom Moldvay. Well, again, we have talked about Harold Johnson before, but what's interesting is that at the time when he was hired, he was the youngest employee ever hired by TSR. So I know Tim Kask was also extremely young, but my sources indicate that when Harold Johnson was hired, he was even younger than that. So what's going to happen is he's going to, he does most of the design on this adventure, but he's not able to finish. So Tom Mulvey comes in to help out. And he is going to do a lot of the typesetting and the final typing of this, but he also makes some edits and additions and changes along the way. And in fact, in the credits in the back, you're going to see a note here, and it says, "Special thanks to Tom Mulvey, without whom this module would not have been finished." So I think that's cool that Harold acknowledged that. So now I have mentioned before that unfortunately that Tom Mulvey has passed away, but Harold Johnson is still around. He's still with us. So that's pretty cool. So again, same character levels. And that's because, as we just read in module A1, characters are not allowed to advance in level during this. So every single one of these is going to be character levels 4 through 7. So whatever you start with in A1, that's what you're going to be when you finish in A4. Again, assuming you're doing tournament play. If you're playing it as a campaign, I guess it's up to the DM if they want to allow you advance in level or not. However, due to the training, it's probably not going to happen, that training aspect. Now, as you saw, module A1 was, I think, 20 pages, including the monsters. This one is going to double that. This is going to end up being 40 pages. It is the longest adventure of the A series by far. So at 40 pages, most of them come in at 24 or so. And just for comparison's sake, if we look at, this is the very first module, again, ever published by TSR. Mind you can see is in terrible shape because the front I got this from tried to 3-hole punch it and clearly had trouble using the 3-hole punch, which reminds me of Charlie Brown trying to use the scissors to make the ghost costume in the Halloween special. 8 pages. This ends the expedition to the steading. So this entire adventure was 8 pages. This is 40, 2 years later, doing a 40-page adventure. So there's a lot of reasons for that in here, and we'll talk about them as we go through this. But Harold Johnson is the person who came up with the idea that we're going to see explored in A4. So we'll just get to that now. He ran some TSR executives through an adventure, friends, like colleagues that he was working with. He ran them through the adventure, and the idea of this adventure was that the players started out having been captured and without any of their equipment with them. And the people that had never been done before. And the people that he was running that for really, really liked that idea. And so, and with the idea being that, they had to rely on their wits. The players did, not on their equipment, on their sheet, right? And Lawrence Schick really liked that idea. So he took that and wrote it as the finale of these 4 sections, or of it's the 3 sections, the first round, the semifinals, and the finals. He wrote it as the finale in A4 for that tournament play. And then, as I mentioned before, all the other sections that came before, the rounds that came before, were written with the idea of knowing that the players were going to start out having been captured with no equipment at the beginning of A4. So obviously that was a huge spoiler alert if people are planning to play this, but I did warn you at the beginning. So hopefully that doesn't ruin it for everybody. But that was a huge thing at the time. It's such a trope now. TSR is going to use it over and over and over again in their adventures. But at the time when this was written, nobody really had expected that because it was a novel idea. So I think that's kind of cool. Although a lot of people say it takes away player agency, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But and I know a lot of people think it's so cliche now to do it, but you just have to remember when this was done, no one had seen that before. So the design goals that Harold talks about as being part of these adventures that they're writing, not just A2 specifically, but sort of like all of them, they wanted to make sure that a DM could use strategy to help challenge their players to think and where even like weak monsters could be dangerous if those weak monsters are played intelligently. And that's the reason why they subvert those expectations by having the monsters start out to be harder. And as the players move through, they might see, like, they start out seeing hobgoblins and orcs, but then they start to see goblins, and they might think like, okay, this will be a lot easier, but there are a lot of goblins and they're being played more intelligently by the DM, right? And to where we get to the end, we'll just tell you now. In this one, A4, the finale, the main base monster in here are kobolds. And you would think like that's the weakest of the humanoid monsters that you'd want to have facing your player characters at levels 4 through 7. The reason they did that though is because in A4 the kobolds present they present a really aggressive challenge, because remember, your player characters have been captured and they don't have any of their equipment. So kobolds in that case can be pretty powerful, especially when there's a lot of them. Okay, so that was one of the design goals. They wanted to, and again, we talked about the heroes. As the heroes rise in level of the adventure, the monsters get easier. And then they wanted the challenges to test the ability of the players to think, not just the characters and what their abilities and equipment were. And also to force the players to use teamwork to survive. So that was one of the big design goals. And they wanted the DMs to encourage the players to think creatively and to come up with unique solutions to the obstacles that are being presented by the DM. And so very specifically in these tournament adventures, and unlike previous tournament adventures, there was a lot of latitude given to the DM to make sure that the players knew that there wasn't just a single solution that the DM had thought of, or that, that the authors, the creators had thought of, that it's open for the players to come up with a unique solution. There's not just one way to achieve success. However, there are some other things that are going to happen with these that do kind of make that a little bit more difficult. And we'll get to that as we get deeper into the series. Okay, so now in the B series, there's one additional person that we want to talk about in the credits here. So, I mean, there's a lot of people that worked on this, but it's pretty much the same people that we've seen. Harold Johnson, Tom Mulvey, Dave Cook, Harold Johnson, Tom Mulvey, Evan Robinson, Lawrence Schick, Edward G. Solers. That's the new name we see here. So he worked on development and in editing. Edward G. Solers. So he worked on a lot of things for TSR at the time. He worked on all of the A series, a lot of the A series. He worked on the B series of modules, some of them, a lot of work with Boot Hill, some work on Gamma World, wrote a lot of articles for Dragon Magazine, and is also a board game designer, like outside of role-playing games. So that's kind of cool to learn a little bit about Edward. Knowing going fast on these creators this time, I usually do a little bit of a deeper dive, but I'm covering 4 modules at once, so I have to be a little judicious here. So this particular adventure is written with the idea that you are going to use a map that you found at the end of A1 in order to find the slavers' headquarters in here. Now, you're not going to find it in here, but that was the idea of what you should be going for. So again, we see this trade dress. We have this cover art here. Now, this is by Jim Rosloff, and we see what appears to be, these are hobgoblins, and they're being led by this creature. And this is a new monster that's going to debut in here. This is a boggle, and we'll get to that later. Okay, and then we see some characters hiding out. I like Jim Rosloff art. I don't really think this necessarily makes me excited about wanting to play this adventure, but that's neither here nor there. Now, this is one of the other new monsters that's going to debut in here. There are 4 total. This is a cloaker. And now the boggle and the cloaker are going to have some history going forward. They're both going to appear in the monster manual too, along with the other 2 monsters that debut in here. However, the cloaker and the boggle are going to have a life beyond the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons monster manual too. From 1983, cloakers are kind of like this weird alien creepy thing here. And they, if memory serves, they kind of end up being part of the Forgotten Realms lore. And so they stick around for quite a while. So this artwork here is by Errol Otis, and he's the perfect one. Anytime you need something weird and creepy and alien, Errol Otis is your guy. And I think he really knocks it out of the park on this one with how weird and creepy this cloaker thing is. Okay, so that's the art. And again, so you are trying to find the slavers' headquarters, and you are still in the Pommage. Okay, so this is a map from the World of Greyhawk setting, box set from 1983. That's lovely map by Darlene. And you see the Pomars all the way over here with the Drakensgrab Hills and then city of Highport. So Highport is where the module A1 takes place in the city of Highport. That was once a human city that's been overrun by humanoids. And adventure A2. So what happens is in A1, you're going to find a map that's going to lead you somewhere in the Drakensgrab Hills to find the headquarters of the slave lords. Okay, so that is where this adventure takes place. So they're really trying to expand the world of Greyhawk at this point. All right. So you find this map, and the problem with this is, I mean, first off, this map is so packed. It's very, I mean, I think it's a little difficult to read. The numbers are very, very small, and it's just jam packed with so many encounters. This one as well. I mean, look, there's just so much in here. There's so much added to this particular adventure to expand it, but it doesn't always necessarily make sense as far as like how it connects together with the previous adventure with A1, and also even between, because remember, there's two different first round adventures that are put in here that weren't necessarily intended to be played together. They were just used as rounds to kind of like weed people out before moving to the semifinal. And so here you're trying to put them together, and you're adding all this expanded material, and it's written by a different author. And so the way the writing it's written and the text, it's very text heavy. There's very few interior illustrations in here. And when they are, they're so small, as you can see right there. I mean, look how many pages we're going without another illustration. That's 8. That's 10. That's 12. That's 14. 16. And finally, we get a small illustration here. Okay, so and there's nothing wrong with the illustrations. They're serviceable, I guess you could call it that. But they're just few and far between, and they don't always illustrate the things that you want. So you see this picture here by Jeff D. This is of one of the slave lords that you're going to encounter in this adventure. This is I'm going to say Icar. I believe that's who this is. He's a blind fighter guy. So you see this helmet over his eye. So this is cool. However, you meet 5 of them in here, and that's the only one who gets an illustration. They have these cool leaders. So Marquesa is a magic user fighter, and says she's the leader of the Hill Fort and the overseer of this part of the slave lord's operation. And it gives you like some quick details. Well, this is going to be consistent with all these. So here's Icar. He's a fighter. The executioner is an ogre. And it only tells you that just because of the way they write it. He says, Executioner is Icar's battle-won friend and lieutenant. He is well aware that he is superior to most ogres and proud of it. It never tells you in the stat block that he's an ogre. You have to read it buried in this line here. Why doesn't it say Executioner, ogre, AC 4? Like, it doesn't say that. You'll notice with these other characters, it doesn't tell you what, it just gives you the class. It doesn't tell you what species or race they are. So here's Guliet, who is Marques's assistant. She's a magic user cleric. And then you have Blackthorn, who is an ogre magi. So once again, like, see down here, it says he is a representative of the slave lords and the captain of Marques's dungeon guards. Blackthorn always appears in polymorph form. And you're like, what are you talking about? How is he polymorph? And it says, in this case, as a 7-foot tall humanoid with gray skin, sparse hair, sunken eyes, and a skeletal, emaciated physique on which his armor hangs loosely, and he enjoys watching the impression his bizarre appearance has on Marques's troops. And then in the second paragraph, you get, like all ogre magi, Blackthorn can fly, become invisible. Like, just tell us right up front that he's an ogre magi. Like, that kind of writing, I don't like that. I don't like having to search to figure out what things are. Now, the thing is, Marquesa is an elf. It doesn't tell you anywhere in here that she's an elf. She's also chaotic evil. However, that's not in her stat block because they didn't used to put alignment in stat blocks for whatever reason. Guliet is a goblin witch doctor, which is from the Dungeon Master's Guide. It tells you how to create that. But again, it's not in the stat block here. So I don't necessarily like things like that. I think it could be much clearer. And again, you just see it's very text heavy. It's very dense. Now, it does have some cool wilderness encounter tables, which I like. I think that's kind of neat. And I like that it does create a wilderness part of the adventure. That's part of the stuff that they include in this that's new to expand it. They include what happens between leaving the slave pits of the Undercity in A1 and getting to the stockade here in A2. There's a wilderness section at the upfront, which is what these wilderness encounter tables for. I do like that. I think that that's cool. And the tournament, if you started this, you just started at the stockade because, again, remember, this is technically still part of the first round. So there are people playing this that had no idea what happened in that module A1 because it wasn't relevant to them being scored and judged. Okay, so the stockade and the dungeon in this one are going to be presented separately, as with, we saw in the other one. And there's really no link between them. And again, that's because they weren't written to be linked. So now what's interesting in here is that people have pointed out on the map that the stockade and the dungeon aren't even connected on the map. And that was like a failure of how to connect these two. And that later that was fixed in this. I think it was in the Scourge of the Slave Lords, which we'll talk about later. Will they put that connection back together? I think it's right here where they thought that should be. But then they took it out when it was reprinted again. So who knows? Some people think that wasn't a mistake, that you could because it was like a courtyard. And so the implication is, well, it's open. So of course it's connected because you can just walk across. But some people thought that they needed to be a little bit more specific about how those things were connected. Okay. So you're trying to find the Slayers headquarters. And these are a very hack and slash dungeon crawl type of adventure. So, and that's, again, designed for tournament play because that's very easy to score. You fight the monsters. Do you survive? You get the points, right? So trying to score things other than that can be very, very difficult. So in a tournament scenario, right? So that's how these are designed. Now, there is some really fun stuff in here. So as an example, so there's this cool section here, the Madman's Lair, Encounter 16 on page 12. And it says, this section of the Old Fort is shunned by the hobgoblins and their allies because it's believed to be haunted. In this area lives a madman who was a fighter, captured by the Slayers and tortured to the point of madness. He has managed to escape, but still believes the Slayers are after him. He set up a number of tricks and traps in the area to make the hobgoblins think the place is haunted. That's a really fun encounter to roleplay if you want to do that. Now, that's part of the tricks and traps section that we talked about. But I think it could be really fun if you're into role playing like that. However, it does bring up something that is common in this specific adventure. And that is some of the themes start to get really dark. Obviously, the subject of slavery is not fun to deal with anyway, and it's kind of dark. And so that's why you're in your heroes and you're taking on the slayers to defeat them. In here, it goes even beyond that. So this guy has been tortured and he's gone mad, and that sucks. That sucks for him, And so, I mean, it again, I think it would be really fun to role play, but torture can be a little bit of a dicey subject depending on the age of your players. As a reminder, I have both adult players who wouldn't have a problem with this, but I also have teenage girl players. And especially when we started, I mean, they weren't even teens. They were like 10, 11. I'm not sure that I would have wanted to discuss torture and somebody going mad from having been imprisoned and enslaved. I might deal with it now, but I'd probably ask them ahead of time a little bit, like what their thoughts are on that. But there's also that Marquesa, the evil elf I was talking about, we'll get to her in a second, is a really cool, fascinating character that, again, I think has legs to role play a lot with her. But she is deliberately experimenting on captured slaves to create new creations out of them. It's really icky. She's very evil, and the things that she's doing are pretty uncomfortable, and it reminds you of Nazis and eugenics and things like that. That's the level of grossness that we're talking about here. So again, the themes get very, very dark, and especially in this particular adventure. And it's just something to be aware of, I think, if that's something that, you find, undesirable to talk about, and that's totally fine. Now, one of the other things that we're going to see here, I talked about that trade dress that we're seeing as we're starting to get a unified look of the adventures, is you see here the boxed text. So let's go back to G1 really quick. When this was written, there is no boxed text in this because nobody knew that then. It's just big chunks of paragraphs And as the DM, you should read through this and then kind of rewrite it so that you can run it at the table, which is how I do pretty much every adventure. This one includes box text, and it's one of the first modules that does that. So B2, Keep on the Borderlands, does not have box text. That came out in 1979. This is 1980, and we're seeing box text. I don't know that A1 was the first module to do that, but it is among the first to have the box text. And it's kind of even controversial today. A lot of people hate the idea of box text. I have played adventures with a DM friend of mine who it wasn't D&D, it was a different game, but it had box text, and he got so focused on reading the box text that he never looked up, and he started to just kind of drone, and then his eyes sort of like forgot about reading the box text, and so he started reading everything underneath as he was reading through, and so he was telling us things that we shouldn't have known because he got so fixated on reading. I don't like to use box text. I use bullet points. Even if it's written out for me, I will use bullet points and put it in my DM's notebook, and that way I'm not trying to read. I'm just trying to glance, and then I'm looking my players and telling them what they see, not putting my head down to read. But that was part of a new thing with these adventures at the time, was this box text. Okay, so as you saw, the text is very, very dense, as are the maps even. Now, the Drakensgrab Hills, there are no details given about those hills at all. The adventure's set there, but for the tournament, it wasn't necessary to have the details. And so while they add a wilderness section in this module, in this adventure, it's really kind of interesting because, they don't really expand on it. It's just you have the wandering monster table and things like that. Again, it's really more of a hack and slash. There's a trick in here that really makes no sense. It's the use of a mirror. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but once you know what it is, I know why they did it. It's put there very specifically to make the players cast a very specific spell as a waste of resources, as to try to test them. And I guess it's a smart thing to do by the monsters, but it seems overly complicated for what they were trying to accomplish. So I do like the NPCs, as I mentioned. I just wish that there were some illustrations for them. So here's the witch doctor. Here's Gouliette, and this is where it finally tells you that she is a goblin. And then you're going to see Marquesa come up later on. Now, Marquesa, here's the torture chamber, as I mentioned. Okay, screaming comes from beyond the door and light shines under it. The door is open. An enormous pillared room can be seen. Okay, so that's going to go on. You have the cheese curing room. That's so funny. There's an alchemist in here. All these people hired by Marquesa. There's the beekeeper storage. Why are there bees in the dungeon? I don't know. I don't know where they get access to sunlight and flowers and things like that, but there's bees down here. There's a warg kennel. And then here's Marquesa's laboratory. These doors open onto a room of great size, over 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, dimly lit by the party's torches. So it goes on and on. There's, beakers, flasks, things like that. There's a stuffed owl on a pedestal, cabinets and a workbench, etc. There's helpers for her in there for Marquesa. And then it talks a little bit about Marquesa and gives you some interesting ways to play her. I just wish there was an illustration, because there really isn't one of any importance in here. There's a werewolf. There's bugbears. There's just all kinds of stuff in here. It's very encounter heavy, which is really, I thought, kind of interesting, I guess, for lack of a better word. I think Marquesa could make a great long-term villain, but unfortunately, this is the only adventure that she shows up in of these 4. So she's going to be gone after this one. So again, there are 4 new monsters in here: the Phantom, the Boggle, the Cloaker, and the Haunt. Now, the Boggle and the Cloaker were the ones that were used in the original tournament adventures. So one of the sections had the Boggle in it, and then one had the Cloaker, because those are the 2 new monsters. The Cloaker's used very oddly in this because it is an intelligent monster that with some really interesting abilities. But in here, the only thing that it's doing is keeping the slaves from revolting. It's keeping them subdued. The Phantom and the Haunt are kind of like the two that were added for the expanded play in here. The Phantom's really more of like a trick than a monster, kind of. And then the Haunt's kind of cool, but again, not part of the original tournament. So this one's very tough. There's tons of hobgoblins in here. It's the same tournament characters that we've seen before. You see the scoring there. And that is A2. Now let's go to A3. This is written by Alan Hammock. Now, we have talked about Alan before, but probably most famous for either his work of writing the top secret role-playing game, but also a very famous and popular module, which is C2, the Ghost Tower of Inverness. So now what's interesting is the A3 is going to be published in May of 1981. That's before A2. So even though A2 comes first, because of all the added material in here, to make this a 40-page adventure, it's going to be published a couple months after both A3 and A4. So the idea in this one is that you're trying to make your way to the Eyrie, which is the headquarters. The Eyrie is the headquarters, which is why, again, Eyrie was used for A, through a series of different caves. So part 1 is going to be a cave crawl, and it's going to be all 9 encounters of the cave crawl in just 4 pages. And then part 2 of it is the catacombs. And that's also going to be the 9 encounters from the adventure. And that's going to be in 4 pages. Now that catacombs and those 9 encounters, that was the semifinal of the adventure. So remember the first part, the caves of getting there, that is the last of the 5 first round adventures. Okay. And then what's going to happen in between here is they're going to set up this town called Sydenham. The hidden city of Sydenham, which is the city where the slave lords live. So when I say set up, I'm being very loose with that, and we'll talk about that. But this is a very, very linear adventure. It's almost at Dragonlance level of linearity of like, it was designed that you have to go through the 9 encounters in the order that they're presented. And the tournament sections here aren't expanded. So unlike the other modules that we've seen where they expanded it, the tournament sections aren't expanded. The expansion comes from when they describe the city of Sydenham. Just describe, again, using that loosely. All right, but let's start out with our cover art here. So this is by Jeff D. Again, kind of that superhero quality, but it's pretty cool. So these are the 5 slave lords that you're going to fight in this particular adventure. And then the art on the back cover is again by our friend Errol Otis, where we see the characters fighting what looks like an ankylosaurus. I'm not gonna spoil that. Okay, so and again, you see the text here. I'm not going to read through this. You can look at that if you pause the video just to see what this particular one is about. All right, and then just credits wise, let's look in the back here and see what we have. So it's the same kind of people that we've seen. As memory serves, there really aren't any new people on here. John Pickens is listed as editing, but we have talked about John before. And John actually has been kind enough to jump into the comments of some of my other videos. I usually think it's when I'm talking about Dragon Magazine because he wrote some of my favorite articles in there. And he commented on writing it, which I thought was really cool. So again, something to beware of. Not beware of in a bad way, but like to be on the lookout for is that there are former employees of TSR. So John Pickens, William W. Connors will come into the comments. And then also Professor Holmes' son, Chris, he comes into the comments and talks about stuff that his dad did from the Holmes edition. Okay, and then again, we see play testing here. We see the art. We've talked about all those guys before. So we're kind of getting to the point where we're looking at the same people time and time again. Okay, so the idea here is that you're looking for the area, the headquarters, but to get there you have to go through these caves, and that was again with the last part of that first round of adventures. Now, some of the cool things that are in here. Well, this city of Sydenham or Suderham. I keep saying Suden. It's Suderham. It's really, I think it's a cool idea. Now the name comes from, this was Alan Hammock says that the name was inspired by kind of thinking of the idea of South Home. So he said he likes to do like kind of faux Greek or faux Latin things, mix things together. So Suderham is supposed to evoke the idea of South home, and that's honoring his home, his Alabama roots. He's from Alabama originally, but also he says Suderham is sort of like a bit of an homage to his friend Dave Sutherland. So I thought that's kind of neat. So as far as a city, at this point in time, we hadn't really seen too many cities from TSR other than the village of Hamlet. However, the details of this are almost non-existent. So it tells you straight up right here, shops and places of business, unless otherwise noticed, are now closed. So then you see, as it goes through to list this, like, look at this. B9, food store, closed. B10, trinket shop, closed. B11, food store, closed. And it just keeps going on. The armor shop is closed. B11, or B, whatever that is, 15. Okay. And then, I mean, just look at this page. The official quarter, lumber warehouse, farming tools and equipment storage, nail warehouse, lumber warehouse. Okay. Cloth warehouse, fighters guild, temple of the earth dragon, cloth warehouse, fruits and preserved meat stores, oil warehouse, lumber warehouse, stone and brick warehouse, leather warehouse, grain warehouse, grain processing, all closed. So it's like they put this cool city in here and then they didn't detail it at all. So if you're a DM that likes to come up with those kinds of details, this module series is great for you. Like the city of Highport in module A1, not detailed at all. So it gives you just a sketch of like what's going on in this town. And it's a town that once was run by humans. It's been overrun by humanoids. There's a lot of cool ideas there that you can do to make that really cool, but you have to do it on your own. They're not going to give you any tips on how to do that. And pretty much the same here with Suderham. So they tell you the shops that are here, but then they don't give you any details on like who runs it, the names of the people, what it's about, what you can buy there, anything like that. That's all not in here. So to me, it's a little bit of a letdown. But you know, they're trying to save space, of course. And it also, the city is not really relevant to the rest of the adventure. The only thing that you need to do in the city is find the sewers that will lead you to the area. So once you get into the sewers, that's the tunnel that you're going to use to make your way to find the headquarters that you're making your way toward. Okay. So, I think that's, you know, I think there's a lot of potential here that was not necessarily, I don't want to say it was wasted potential. I just think there could have been some stuff added. Now, there are some cool encounters in the city if you want. There's an Assassin's Guild. And there's some really interesting details here. If you commit an assassination in the town without belonging to the guild and you try to come back or whatever, like it tells you what the assassins do once they find out about that. There's a pretty interesting tavern here. And as you see, there's a fun character here. And I'm going to tell you his name. His name is IRS the Cut Purse. So it looks like it might be Ayers, but Alan Hammock said, well, he didn't say how to pronounce it, but he said that is a deliberate dig at the IRS. And he was mad at them for some tax issues that were going on at the time. And so he named this character, you know, the Cut Purse. It's like a thief, right? And so that name is meant to be pronounced IRS. IRS. So I thought that was really funny to like, you know, work. Now I do that all the time in my campaigns. I work names. I'm sure you guys too. Make sure to share those in the comments because I'd love to hear some of your goofy pun names that you use. So once you get out of the city, then the catacombs section is going to return. This is a Bill Willingham painting, really quick, or not painting, Bill Willingham illustration. This is of the House of Ill Repute that's there. So I always like his illustrations a lot. But it's going to return you to the dungeon crawl. And there's some really challenging encounters. Now, another thing that's going to happen in here is there's a blank page for DM notes. Because remember, these things have to be printed in groups of 4 pages, and they didn't have enough material. So, and then they left another blank page here for player notes. They also left a blank player city map of Suderham, even though there's really no point to explore this because all the shops are closed. So that's an interesting choice. But in the catacombs, there's some, like I said, some really challenging things in here. There's a pit trap that is full of a gelatinous cube. So that's very dangerous. And then you said, stop, read this before continuing. And so there's going to be some details here. If the DM is using this module tournament, the party will be defeated. So that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about. At the end of this adventure, you're going to encounter 5 of the 9 slave lords of this module, A3. And they had to design the adventure to lead to the capture and having the players start out with no equipment in A4. So it's a pre-gone conclusion that when you're playing these three adventures, the characters will be defeated. And so even Alan Hammock himself, he said he considered it to be a grossly unfair deus ex machina. But basically, in the tournament, the players are gassed and they wake up without their equipment, like trapped, and they have to escape in A4. And again, he said he thought it was very unfair. But if you're playing it as campaign play, I think it's actually worse because the players have no option and they are going to try everything they can to not be captured or killed. And but as the DM, you don't let that happen. They will be captured, and if they're killed, they will be resurrected for the slave lords. So that's the only way around it. So again, like I said, it's extremely, extremely linear. So what's funny is like in the original tournament, they said like a lot of the players were surprised at that once their characters either died or were gassed or whatever. They thought that they'd failed, and then they got the notifications like you've advanced to the next round, to like the finals. And a lot of them were super surprised that had happened because they just assumed they'd screwed up. So again, this was new at the time, and it's it's an interesting thing, but it's just something that I think has been overdone so much. All right, now this is the new monster that debuted in this. This is the Storoper or Stone Roper. Really hasn't had legs to kind of, a lot of these monsters haven't really kind of like moved on from debuting in these adventures for whatever reason. So, but that's A3. Now let's wrap up with A4. Okay, and let's wrap up our look at the A series of modules with A4. This is In the Dungeons of the Slave Lords. Now, this is by Lawrence Schick. And again, we're going to look at this cover art here really quick. This is by Errol Otis. And so why is it by Errol Otis? Well, we've got these little mushroomy guys here. We're going to deal with them in a second. But again, when you want something like I said, weird, alien, whatever, Cthulhu, mushrooms, Errol Otis is your guy. So I think he was the perfect choice for this particular cover. And then on the back here, we have a picture by Willingham. I really dig this. You see this guy here, he's holding a cross, but he's being attacked by this creature, which is, it's a vampire. And then I just love the expression on this young woman's face. She's got this stake, but she looks like she's not quite sure if this is going to work, but she's trying to save this other guy over here. So I think that's a fun painting. Now, really quickly in the credits, we do have one new name to talk about. And that's going to be on editing, Steve Sullivan. So, Steve, from what I can tell, now this is interesting because a lot of these people, the editors don't necessarily always get called out for their work in the role-playing game field. However, I did find a Steve Sullivan who worked at TSR on Scourge of the Slave Lords and Castle Amber, and I think it's the same Steve, although Steve Sullivan is a relatively common name. So if you know different, feel free to correct me, but I believe that that's the Steve that we're talking about. And what I found really fascinating about Steve was that he started or taught a class on Dungeons and Dragons at MIT, and he was the first person in the United States to teach a class like that. So I thought that's kind of cool, and I especially resonate with that because I taught a class on D&D at my daughter's school just last week. The day, last Tuesday, the day my Moldvay basic video debuted. And that was kind of fun. I was a guest lecturer, so I was only there for one day, but I thought it was really fun. Okay, so that's our look at the art here. So you can see the maps on the inside front cover, and you've got this nice art here on the inside front. This is also by Errol Otis. You see his signature right there. So that's this creepy guy. Errol is very good at scale, at doing things like these little guys down here, providing context for how big this thing is that they're fighting right here. So I always really appreciate that from Errol Otis. So the idea here again is that the party has been captured and they've been relieved of all of their equipment, including any kind of light sources. So anybody in this adventure that doesn't have infravision, any human characters are going to have a really hard time until they can figure out how to create some light. And again, it's a very common trope now, but it was so new at the time. And so it's sort of like a reverse dungeon crawl in a way, because you're trying to get out of the dungeon after having been captured and needing to find your equipment. So the idea is that, are the players able to work this out besides just looking at their character sheets to see what they could use at their hand? It's like they have to figure out a use for the things that they come across during the adventures. Now, Lawrence Schick, who is the author on this particular one, he does create some kind of conceits to give the players a little bit of help. So he enables the magic users and illusionists to come across a couple of scrolls. So there's 2 magic user scrolls and an illusionist scroll that they can get their hands on, or that somehow were overlooked. And also the jailers have not paid attention to where any clerics in the party can have prayed and replaced their spells. But that's it. That's the only thing that they're going to start with. So I talked before that kobolds are used as the monsters here, and it's specifically because they're weak, but they're going to present a real challenge to characters that don't have any equipment or weapons or anything like that. So the original tournament adventure for this just dealt with the escape from the dungeon. And then once you get out, like that was it. So you see here the tournament scoring happens halfway through this adventure. So on page 14, and then it's over. What was added for this, there was an expansion, was sort of like, well, what happens next? What's going to happen once you get out of the dungeons? And also, like, what happens to these slave lords? So there's a really fun picture here. We just saw it a second ago. This is going to also be by Errol Otis, but these are the slave lords that you're going to be fighting in this one. So obviously you see a drow off there, and there's an evil monk, and some other folks here. So those are the slave lords, and they are trying to escape this little island that they live on, which is where the characters have escaped from as well. And the reason why is it's extremely convoluted, but essentially there's an earthquake and then there's a volcanic eruption that's going to destroy the headquarters of the slavers. So that sucks because the players have nothing to do with that. They have no control over this volcanic thing. So now everyone's trying to get away. And so there can be a fight with the slavers to try to kill them and take the boat that they're escaping on, or the players can try to find another boat. There's like a lot of different things. But it's really interesting. Now this part deals here, the Cave of the Bats and all this stuff, the exit, it deals with, in D&D terms, a very early form of wilderness exploration, because, most of the original adventures were dungeon crawls, but this one's going to have some wilderness exploration. And this is before, like, the expert rules are going to be published for Moldvay Basic, which I know this is advanced D&D, but the expert rules deal with wilderness exploration. There's wilderness exploration explained in original D&D, but it basically tells you to use the outdoor survival map from a completely different game by Avalon Hill. So what's interesting here is that this is the wilderness map. And the one thing you'll see, once you see it, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's not hex-based. It's square-based. It's using regular graph paper, not hex paper, for the wilderness section, because they hadn't dealt with that yet. In the expert rules for Moldvay Basic, they are going to use hexes. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. The geology that happens in this adventure makes no sense at all, because the caves are made of limestone, but there's a volcano, so it should be volcanic rock. And even in here tells you at a certain point, like, yeah, it doesn't make sense. Like, it's best to just kind of like ignore that and move on. But there's a lot of things that don't really work in here. That from a geology or a realism standpoint, and you're just supposed to kind of close one eye toward it and keep going. But overall, again, this series really focuses on the dungeon crawl for the tournament play, and when it tries to expand, I don't necessarily think it does it in such a way that's super helpful. So the town of Highport's not detailed. We talked about that. Suderham's not detailed. The wilderness crawl in here, again, there's some cool stuff, but it doesn't necessarily make sense. So, that's all stuff that kind of just comes up with trying to get these things published and expand them and get them out as quickly as possible. Because again, the intent was to have all these available at Gen Con, and that didn't happen. Okay. So the new monsters introduced here are going to be the Magman and the Myconid, or the Fungus Man. Now the Myconids are going to stick around for a while in D&D terms. You also have the Cave Fisher, And all these are going to be in the monster manual too. Like all of the monsters in here, the sandling as well. So all the monsters introduced in A1 through A4 are going to reappear in the 1983 Monster Manual 2. However, as far as the legacy, it's really the myconids or the fungus man that have any kind of long-term use in Dungeons and Dragons, kind of like going forward. The myconids, they're really interesting. I mean, you needed mushroom men that should have been in D&D earlier. And these guys are kind of cool because they use like some spores to communicate, but they also use them to attack, which is kind of fun. So Lawrence Schick was the one who came up with the idea for the myconids, and he said that he went to Errol Otis and said, I want the myconids to look like the dancing mushrooms from the Walt Disney Fantasia film, only sinister. And he's like, Errol Otis knocked it out of the park. Like, he exactly did what I was envisioning in my head, which is because he was definitely the guy to use that. So, and he says, Lawrence Schick, the other thing that he says about this is that he was really trying to write every encounter, especially in this one, because this is the one that he was directly responsible for writing, to defy the player expectations. Writing a thing and then it turns it on its head because the players are not expecting that. So that was kind of like his approach to this, like the whole series, but specifically this adventure. And so that is going to be the end of A4 specifically that we're going to talk about here today. Now, what's going to happen with this is like the legacy of these. Well, these were all published again in 1980 for A1 and then 1981 for A2 through A4. And then what's going to happen after that is in 1986, TSR is then going to publish the second of their super modules, they called them at the time. So they're going to publish Scourge of the Slave Lords, A1 through 4, covered by Jeff Easley. It's a 128-page adventure book, and it essentially collects all 4 of the adventures together. And it is for higher level play because what they did was create the first super module, which was the Temple of Elemental Evil, which is T1 through 4. If you recall from my earlier videos, T2 through 4 were never published individually. It was only T1. And then they published the super module T1 through 4, Temple of Elemental Evil. And that leads you to taking on the Scourge of the Slave Lords, A1 through 4. Okay, and so they needed to up the levels a little bit to make it a little bit more difficult because you gain so many levels in T1 through 4. And then that's going to culminate with the third of the super modules, which is GDQ 1 through 7, Queen of the Spiders. So that's the Giant series, the Drow series, and then Q1, Queen of the Demon Web Pits. So that was Scourge of the Slave Lords. The new material is written by Dave Cook, who wrote A1, and it has multiple editors, including all the editors that worked on 1 through 4, plus Steve Winter was added. I've talked about Steve before because I got a chance to work with him on the one-page dungeon contest several years ago. He was one of the fellow judges, which was really cool. Now, in 2000, Wizards of the Coast, by this point having acquired TSR in 1997, they're going to publish a module called Slavers. And it was written for 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And it's set 10 years after the events that happen in A1 through 4. So in later era TSR stuff, they were really big on trying to advance the timeline. And so they would come up for, whether it was Greyhawk or Forgotten Realms or whatever it was, it would be these looks back at like, here's what's happened in the intervening years. And then you have to deal with something again, but within the same area. And that prevented you from replaying the same adventures, but you still got the same feel. So that's the book Slavers. And then in 2013, Wizards of the Coast is going to come out with yet another product, and it was called Against the Slave Lords. So this is an interesting one. Basically, what's going on at this period of time, if you remember, is that 4th edition had come out in 2008. And already by 2012, they've realized, like, we need to do something. It's not selling the way that we wanted it to. And so they're slowly kind of starting to shut down 4th edition. And they've announced that they're going to be working on 5th edition. I think at the time they were calling it 1D&D, or no, that was the new edition. Whatever it was, they were calling it something else. And but it's eventually going to be known as 5th edition. But they were working on that as early as 2012. So the problem that they're going to have is that they can't just stop publishing stuff for 2 years because 5th edition is not going to be published until 2014. So that's why you saw in that time period, like 2012, 13, and 14, you started to see Wizards of the Coast reprinting old books. They did reprints of the 1st edition AD&D books. I think they even did reprints of the 3rd edition books. They did some of the adventures, like they did a reprint of Unearthed Arcana, all this kind of stuff. Well, that's why Against the Slave Lords is republished in 2013. It's a hardcover book that collects all 4 of the modules, A1 through 4. It's not the Scourge of the Slave Lords because that was rewritten. This is the original versions of these modules. Plus, they had Skip Williams write an introductory adventure called A0, and that was The Danger at Dark Shelf Quarry. So I kind of was disappointed that they didn't somehow work Slave Lords into the title, because all the other modules, as you see, have something like Slavers, Slave Lords, Slave Lords. A1 was Slave Pits of the Undercity. But it's the Danger at Dark Shelf Quarry. And Skip Williams is the guy who for years ran the Sage Advice in Dragon Magazine to tell, like, when people write in to ask rules questions. So he wrote that introduction to kind of serve as a bridge to introduce people to these adventures. And what's really cool about that one, the Against the Slave Lords, is that it includes little essays by the 4 surviving authors. So Dave Cook, Harold Johnson, Alan Hammock, and Lawrence Schick, about the adventures that they wrote. So unfortunately, the only one that they couldn't include, of course, was Tom Mulvey, because by that point he had passed away. And Harold Johnson actually mentions Tom in his essay. But they write about working on these. And so a lot of the details that I provided in here, like that background of stuff, like some of the names and things like that, that comes from those essays. So that book is worth picking up just to read those essays, I think. And especially if you don't have the original adventures, you can get them from there. Now, all these original adventures are available on DriveThruRPG as PDF, and I think as POD also. So that's, I would say, your way to go if you don't have these yet and you're looking to play or explore them with your group. You can also find them on eBay and stuff, like the original ones. And they're not as expensive as some of the other ones. These are considered classics, but they're not classic in the sense that, like, Tomb of Horrors is a classic, or Isle of Dread, that kind of thing. So that's going to wrap up our look at A1, and also our first entry into our look at the TSR modules A to Z. So I'm going to skip the AC ones, and the next time I do one of these, I'm going to cover the B modules. There are, I think, 12 of those. So that's probably going to have to be broken up, because even though my videos are extremely long, I can't do longer than what I've done here, and it's taken almost 2 hours to cover just 4. So I'm going to have to break that up, but I'm going to be doing B. I'll do C. And we'll go along. There are some that I might skip around and not necessarily do them in order, like the Conan the Barbarian ones, and things like that. But let me know if you like that, or if you want me to just literally go in order, and I can do that too. So I'd like to hear that in the comments below. And then while you're down there, make sure to find places where you can join me on social media. You'll find links to my blog. And then right now, if you're looking for ways to support the channel, as always, the 3 best ways to support would be to one, join the fine folks who have done super thanks here. So you see their names listed here. These are folks that have contributed when I make videos. Just click that heart icon with the $sign, and you'll get your name listed up here in the credits of the next video. And then you can also buy something from my shop, a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, notebook, or other item with exclusive designs only available at the Daddy Roll the One shop. And then lastly, you can please help support by buying my supplement for basic Dungeons and Dragons, also for old school essentials, called Alchemy, Explosives, and Inventions. And that has 3 new character classes. It's got guilds, it's got class concepts, it's got a map with a 3-story guild with NPCs and rumors and intrigue and secrets and things like that. It's got new equipment. It has tons of random tables for exploring the idea of playing expert characters in D&D, and I would really appreciate if you would check it out. And if you do get it and you want to review it for your channel, let me know, and I'll drive people over to check out your review. So you can find it at DriveThruRPG, and it's available as a POD or a PDF. And I have either a plain white or a parchment style background. And that's going to wrap up this look at A1 through 4. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and I will talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking and what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So as you can probably tell, I did have a ton of notes for this video, more so than I normally make, covering all 4 of those and like getting notes on all the different creators and stuff. So I basically had a page of notes, of bullet point notes for each of the adventures, plus all the background stuff. So I hope that you found that interesting. I really found the stuff about how it was a tournament module and how originally they weren't designed to go together. Like the first 5 parts were all separate. That's something as a kid I didn't know. So I found a lot of that out, like I said, by reading those introductory essays in that Against the Slave Lords from 2013. So I hope that you also found that as interesting as I did. But let's get into the bonus content, talk about what I was doing while I made all those notes. So we're wrapping up Jazz Appreciation Month, so I'm going to feature yet another jazz album. But I'm also want to talk about this drink. So this is called a fanciulli, Fanciulli, Fanciulli. But I believe in Italian that's pronounced fanciulli. And I guess originally that was a slang word. It might still be for saying like the boys in Italian, but most people think that it was actually named after the director of the United States Marine Corps band at the time, sort of at the turn of the last century. So this drink is thought to date back to about 1910, and it is a riff on a Manhattan. And there are a lot of Manhattan riffs out there, and it's partially because the Manhattan is like your building blocks, right? And then from there, you can adjust. So what they're doing with this one, a Manhattan, is usually 2-to-1 parts of rye whiskey to vermouth. If you use dry vermouth, it's a dry Manhattan. If you use sweet vermouth, it is a sweet Manhattan. And then if you use half and half of each, which I've done here on the channel before, that's called a perfect Manhattan. But the ratio is always going to be 2-to-1, 2 parts whiskey, 1 part vermouth. So, and then it's going to have bitters, usually Angostura, sometimes orange, sometimes a drop of each, which is how I make it. And then it's typically garnished with either a cherry or I usually like it with some orange peel. Now, the fanciulli is going to replace the bitters, the Angostura or the orange bitters. It's going to replace it with Fernet Branca. So I know I talk about Fernet here a lot, but I do like it, and I have some available right now. So the recipe for this, it's very simple. I will put it in the show notes, but it's 2 parts of rye whiskey with 3/4 of an ounce of sweet vermouth, and then 1/4 of an ounce of Fernet. Now, some people will say that because you're adding the Fernet and it's a much more aggressive pour than like just adding a dash or 2 of Angostura bitters, that some people prefer to do this with bourbon instead of rye. And all that's going to do is make it slightly sweeter. The rye is going to make it slightly spicier, and bourbon would make it slightly sweeter. So you could do it with either one. I used rye. It's an interesting story about the fanciulli behind the Marine Corps band. So he was like let go after a while, but in any event, there's a whole category of Manhattan riffs out there. There's a Brooklyn, there's a Bronx. The Bronx gets a little far from being a Manhattan riff. Staten Island and Queens don't really necessarily they have cocktails, but they're not really in the Manhattan family, I wouldn't say. But there's a whole category of cocktails that are now neighborhood based. So people are doing things like the Little Italy or the Green Point, the Red Hook, things like that. And I would say the fanciulli, even though this is old, it kind of fits within that realm. So now this one is originally designed to not have a garnish. So I'm going to just take a sip because it's very, very full. And in fact, as I was holding it, I kind of spilled a little bit down the side of the glass. So yeah, that Fernet really comes through, but it's still, the sweet vermouth helps provide that kind of herbal earthiness. The Fernet is very bitter. It's also herbal. And again, we talked about this. It's mentholy, but it's only 1/4 of an ounce. And then the rye is providing that kind of spicy whiskey note coming throughout. So originally it's intended to not be served with a garnish, which is why I made it this way, because that's the original recipe. Now, typically for me, I would put an orange peel. I would express the orange across the. I just like the brightness. I like in a dark cocktail like this, like a whiskey based cocktail. A lot of times I just kind of like to brighten it up. So that is the fanciulli, and I hope you try it. So, again, usually served in a stem cocktail glass. I'm using a Nick and Nora here. And as a reminder, again, if you haven't seen it, the Nick and Nora glass is named after the characters of Nick and Nora Charles from the movie The Thin Man. And I highly encourage you to watch that movie. It is such a fun, holiday movie. I watch it every year at Christmas time. My friend William Connors, who used to work for TSR, he says he watches it every year. That's like his New Year's Eve movie, because the movie does span across both holidays. So in any case, cheers, or chin chin in Italian. Salute. Mm-hmm. So it's a lovely cocktail. Super easy to make again. Okay. And also, I think the other thing with this is that you can use this as a template to explore. Maybe you don't like Fernet, swap that out with another Amari. Use a Verna or a Nannino or something like that. Those are a little bit sweeter, so you might want to change their proportions, but it's just giving you the building blocks to explore. Now let's get into this album. It's a goofy name, The Fat Albert Rotunda by Herbie Hancock. So I've talked about Herbie here on the channel before. I'm a big fan. I've seen him in concert at the Hollywood Bowl several times. This album was originally created to be the soundtrack for a TV show about Fat Albert. It was called Hey Hey Fat Albert, or Hey Hey It's Fat Albert. Well, that eventually became the Fat Albert cartoon. This music wasn't really used in the show, though. It was intended to be written for it. So it has this different quality. But why I'm showcasing this, I think it's fascinating. So again, I really like Herbie Hancock. He's gone through so many different musical styles in his career. His career's been super long. He still performs. He's performing this summer at the Hollywood Bowl yet again, 2025. And I saw him last year at the Bowl. And he started out performing, or at least his own self-titled albums were coming out as band leader, were coming out as early as 1962 on the Blue Note label. And that's what I wanted to talk about. So Blue Note, very famous jazz label, very specific kind of sound. The Blue Note sound is very, very distinct, and you can hear it right away. And when you hear Herbie's albums for Blue Note, especially the early ones, they really sound very, very different. Maiden Voyage comes around about 1965. That's still Blue Note. And there is a start of a change there, right? You're starting to see a little bit of a change with Maiden Voyage, but it's still kind of, piano based in that realm of the Blue Note notes. This is the first album that he's going to make post Blue Note. This is for Warner Brother Records. This is 1969. And one of the really cool things that I like about so one of my favorite songs on here is called Fat Mama. This is the second track on side one. He uses different sidemen. So there's a different group of sidemen performing some of the tracks on like the opening track and I think the closing track than the other ones, because it's recorded in two different sessions, and he completely does a complete switch over of who's accompanying him. But he's going to move from just regular jazz into jazz funk. And this is the first album where he starts to do that. So if you're familiar with his Headhunters era from 1973, the start of that happens here. And you can hear it, even though he's playing both acoustic, regular piano, and electric piano. You start to hear the shift from that traditional jazz Blue Note style into what's going to become the Headhunter style. So if the only thing that you know of Herbie Hancock is the Rocket song from the 80s, you really owe it to yourself to explore this guy's catalog and figure out what his music is all about, because I love it. I love this album. It's so much fun. I didn't know anything about this album when I picked it up. I saw it for sale at before my friend opened his shop. This is years ago. That was for sale at Amoeba. And I saw, and I was like, Fat Albert Rotunda. I was like, what is this? And I bought it based on just the fact that it was Herbie Hancock. It was an album I didn't have. And I thought it might have a connection to the Fat Albert cartoon, which, I did grow up watching. I mean, it was something that as kids we watched. And so I really liked it. This is the original sleeve that came with it, but I've put it into a new sleeve here. But here's the album. And I highly encourage you to check it out, Fat Albert Rotunda, or just again, explore his catalog. But this is a really interesting point in jazz, which is why I wanted to feature it for Jazz Appreciation Month. So that's the album. That's the drink. Thanks again for watching. I'd love to hear from you in the comments, and I will talk to you next time.